Today we want to discuss working with names in our spreadsheets. Additional information can be found in Chapter 3 of your text. Remember that best practices for you to understand this material would be for you to follow along as I solve the problems on the screen. Therefore, a second screen is extremely important. There are many reasons that we give one or more cells a name, but probably the most important is it's just more intuitive. It makes it easier to understand what's happening when we look at a formula. Let's first give cell D5 a name. Now there's several ways that we can do this. We can either use the name box up here and just type in a name we want and hit enter, and it will have named that cell name you put in the name box. Or we can come up here to formulas, define name, and here we can write in any name we want. Now it looked around this cell and said, oh, well, there's the name interest rate. Maybe that's what they want. In fact, that's exactly what we want. And so we could use that. Or another way to do it is just when we're on the cell or group of cells, right-click and say define name. And here we have that same box come up, and we'll say OK. Usually there's a lot of different ways you can do the same thing in Excel, and so learning several of them may be appropriate. I'll put OK here. And now we have interest rate is defined up here when we look at what we're on, the cell. And so I can use that. I can just come over here and say equals whatever is up above times, and I'll put interest rate, and you'll notice as I start typing that, it figures out that is what's available. I can tab on it and then hit enter, and it's taken and put that name into the formula. Instead of saying take I5 and times D5, it now tells me take this cell next to it and times it by the interest rate. And so it makes it a lot more readable. Also, it makes it a lot easier to remember. If I go to another tab over here, I can say equals 15 times, and I can put in interest rate, and you'll notice it comes up here, and I don't have to remember where that's located. That's cell what on which sheet. I no longer have to worry about it. I have it right there. Later, when I look at this formula, I can say, oh, well, I was multiplying 15 times the interest rate. And if I needed to, I could change the interest rate in the cell that it was found in, and all the formulas would change accordingly. But what if I see this formula and I want to know where and what that formula amount is? I can locate it by going Home, Editing, Find and Select, and go to, and you'll notice I have a list of any names I have available in the sheet. I can click interest rate and say OK. And it immediately went back to D5 on sheet 1. Let's try that again on sheet 3, say. I can also hit just Control G, hold Control down and hit G. It brings up that same box, and I can say, okay, I want to go to interest rate, and it went back to sheet 1, cell D5. Thus it was very quick and easy to locate what that interest rate was. And I could change that interest rate now to 0.09, and everything would change accordingly. So in this case, I could refer to interest rate in another worksheet or even in another workbook, and it would be able to find it if that workbook were open. So we've found that using names is more intuitive. It's easier to remember where to put that information. The scope of the name is throughout the workbook if we allow it to be, or we could set it just to be on that page. We'll show that in a minute. And it's more quick to locate. We can quickly go to that cell. And as we've seen, it's easier to create formulas. They're more meaningful, and you'll find that it's a lot easier to create macros if we're using names. But what happens if we delete that name? Let's do that. So I come up here to Formulas, Define Names, Name Manager, and we will click on interest rates and say delete it. Okay, and close. Now you'll notice here it says I5 times interest rate, but it doesn't know what interest rate is, so it throws out a name error. The same on this next sheet. You can see we have an error there because it doesn't know anything about interest rate. So let's go back to the first sheet here and give that a name again. So I'll come up here, and another way that we can give it a name is I can hit Control F3. And you'll notice it came up with the name manager, and then I could say new, and we could create the name that way. I'm going to not do it that way either. So we have several ways we can do that. The easiest way is just to come up into the name box and type that name in there. But I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to type interest rate, okay, and hit enter. You must enter a valid reference. It doesn't recognize that name. Why isn't it recognizing that name? You can't have spaces in the name. It must begin with a letter or an underscore. You can't use any symbols except underscores and periods, although your author says he's noticed that backslashes and question marks seem to work if not the first character in a name. And you're limited in the name to 255 characters. Well, that's an awful lot of characters for a name. Nobody would have a problem with that except my wife, who likes to name files with a whole paragraph of description of what is in that picture or in that file, and would go over the 255 limit. You could use a single character like an or C, but that defeats the whole purpose, and it might interfere with other shortcuts that you have. You want to have a meaningful name. An or C, or I in this case, just isn't meaningful. It is not case sensitive, so if you capitalize or not, it won't make any difference. There are a few reserved names such as print area, print title, database, criteria, and so forth that you aren't allowed to use, and it won't allow you to create those as names. So let's put a name in that works in here, and I'll put TEREST underscore rate. You'll notice perhaps the first time that it put in that underscore automatically for us because it knew it couldn't have a blank. It looked around and saw, oh, well, it's likely he wants interest rate, which I did. And it went ahead and put that in, and all we did was hit enter. I'll hit enter now, and you'll notice this now works. It recognizes interest rate. Let's erase that name once more, or delete it, and show you one more way that you can approach this. We could use Alt. Notice when I hit that, then every possibility up here now has a letter that I could use. We want to go to the name manager here under formulas, and formulas you'll notice has an M. So I hit M. Again, define names has an M and D, and it brings up the name box. So I could quickly hit Alt-MMD on the keyboard and it would get to the same place as well. These shortcut keys are very important to know. They will make your work go so much faster as you learn and use the different shortcut keys. There used to be other ways of doing shortcuts like the Control-G we did to go back to the name and such, but everything you can reach to on the menu now with the Alt key. If you get used to doing that, then it makes it so you can do things from your keyboard without having to reach and go to your mouse and so forth, and makes your work a lot more fast and effective. I would suggest you take the time to get used to entering your commands that way. It looks like you're doing magic on the keyboard when you do that. I won't do that in this class. I tried that once, and students have no idea what I'm clicking on or what I'm doing. I'm going so fast. So I will take the time to bring up the menus and click on the menus instead so that you can see it. but that would be a good habit for you to use. Also, I think it's extremely important as you're taking this class to be able to follow along and work each of the steps that we do so that they become yours, that you understand what we did and no longer have questions. I'll put OK, and we now have the interest rate again. Cell names can also be non-contiguous. For example, I could have a group of cells here, and then holding my control down, have another group here, and give all of this gray area one name, and then sum all of that all at once. So it doesn't have to be contiguous in order to be named. Now that you've been introduced to named ranges, let's develop some of our skills and see how we can really use these.